Have you ever stopped and really thought about how messed up the Fallout world actually is outside of America? Like, we spend hundreds of hours running around Boston, the Mojave, the Capital Wasteland, blasting raiders and looting fridges that somehow still have edible food in them after 200 years. But the bombs didn't just hit America on October 23, 2077. The whole planet got cooked that day, and every single country has its own horror story attached to it. And trust me, some of these stories are way darker than anything you've ever seen in the games. Today we're descending into the most disturbing countries in the Fallout Iceberg. We're talking about places where the citizens got betrayed by their own governments, countries that became breeding grounds for the worst factions in the franchise, and entire regions that the developers just erased. The further down we go, the more disturbing it gets, and by the bottom of this list, you're gonna wish Bethesda had just left some of this stuff alone. Some of what we're covering today is solid canon. Some are pieced together from holotapes, terminal entries, and accents. And some is the silence itself, because in Fallout, what they don't tell you is almost always worse than what they do. So please be ready, because we're starting at the surface and going all the way to the bottom of the trench, the United Kingdom. Let's start with a country whose disturbing factor isn't loud, it's quiet. The United Kingdom, Britain, jolly old England. And jolly is doing some serious heavy lifting in that sentence because pre-war Britain was a complete nightmare for the people living there. Here's what makes the UK disturbing in the Fallout universe. It wasn't nuked into oblivion in some dramatic exchange. It rotted from the inside out. The European Commonwealth tore itself apart over the last drops of oil on the continent, with neighbors literally going to war with each other over fuel. Imagine France and Germany blasting each other with artillery while regular families just try to find enough food to survive the week. Yeah, that was Britain's reality before America even entered the picture. And the most disturbing part? We have proof someone got out. Alistair Tenpenny, the rich, eccentric British dude who owns Tenpenny Tower in the Capital Wasteland. His accent gives him away the second he opens his mouth. He's clearly British, clearly wealthy, and clearly very far from home. Now think about what kind of person Tenpenny is. This man literally pays caps to have the local town blown up just because he doesn't like looking at it. He sits on his balcony with a sniper rifle and shoots wastelanders for entertainment. That's his hobby. The kind of guy who probably had tea while watching the world burn and complained the cup was the wrong temperature. And here's the disturbing question. If a guy this rotten somehow ended up in irradiated DC, what was he running from back home? What was Britain like that this version of hell looked better than where he came from? That should send chills down your spine, because we have no answers. Just a really bad man, a really long way from home. Ireland, if Britain's horror is whispered, Ireland's is screamed. And we know that for a fact, because we've actually met somebody who lived through it. So if Tenpenny was the wealthy escape story, get ready for the version that didn't have money on its side, Kate. The red-headed brawler from Fallout 4 who you find fighting for her life in Boston's combat zone. Her accent is straight up Irish, and her backstory is hands down one of the most genuinely brutal things in the entire franchise. Kate was born to parents who were so unbelievably awful that calling them human feels generous. They abused her from the time she was 5 years old. They didn't just neglect her, they actively brutalized her for years. And then, when she turned 18, they sold her into slavery, their own daughter. Sold her like she was a busted toaster at a yard sale. She spent 5 years as a slave before she finally escaped. And when she got free, she did the only thing that made sense. She tracked her parents down and killed them both. Honestly, good for her. Some people just need to go, and her parents were clearly speedrunning their way onto that list. After that, Kate ended up in the combat zone, fighting in cage matches for raider entertainment, hooked on Psycho just to numb herself enough to keep swinging. That's the life she escaped to. Let that sink in for a second. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Kate is one Irish person we know about. One, she crossed an ocean to get away from whatever Ireland had become. So how many other kids are still over there right now, getting sold by their own families in a country that was already collapsing before the bombs ever fell? The British Isles in Fallout aren't producing tourists. They're producing trauma cases. Mexico and the Legion Kate's Ireland gave us one survivor. Now let's talk about a country that didn't even get to die on its own terms, because someone else built an empire on its corpse. Mexico is one of the most disturbing entries on this list, and it's mostly because of what rose up out of the ruins. Pre-war, Mexico was already losing its sovereignty as the United States expanded aggressively into its territory. By the time the bombs fell, Mexico had basically been swallowed economically. The Great War just finished the job. But here's where the real horror starts. The territory that used to be northern Mexico became the breeding ground for one of the most genuinely evil factions in the entire franchise, Caesar's Legion. Founded by Edward Sallow, who renamed himself Caesar after reading way too many history books, the Legion operates across what was once the American Southwest and into former Mexican territory. And what does the Legion do? They enslave anyone they can catch. They crucify their enemies and leave them on the side of the road as warnings. They burn villages to the ground for refusing tribute. And women? Women are property, breeding stock, nothing more. Female slaves are passed around between officers and bred like livestock to produce more legionaries. There's a specific horror to the Legion that other factions don't have. They aren't raiders acting on impulse. This is organized, systematic, ideological cruelty justified by a guy who read about Rome and decided humanity should go backwards 2,000 years. So if you're living in former Mexico in the Fallout timeline, congrats. You either get crucified, enslaved, or assigned to a breeding pen. Hope you're not picky. Canada-Mexico got conquered by a faction that rose after the war. Canada had it worse. Canada got conquered before the bombs even fell, and by the country that was supposed to be its closest ally. The United States began annexing Canada in 2072 and finalized the whole thing by January 2076. Just took it, walked in and said, "This is ours now." The official excuse was that America needed Canadian resources for the war effort against China, including access to the Alaskan pipeline that ran through Canadian territory. The annexation was sold to the public as peaceful, which is propaganda speak for we rolled in tanks and shot anyone who disagreed. And here's what makes this so disturbing. We have actual footage. There's a propaganda holotape in Fallout 3 where you literally watch this go down. American soldiers executing a Canadian protester on camera, broadcast as a warning to anyone else thinking about resisting. It's chilling stuff, especially because it's framed like a normal news segment. And in today's update, we shot a guy. Back to you, Bob. Canadians who tried to resist were rounded up and disappeared. Those who complied lived under occupation in their own country. Then the bombs dropped, and Canada caught nukes too, mostly because Chinese missiles were targeting American military installations that had been set up on Canadian soil. So Canadians died for a war they didn't start, in a country that wasn't even theirs anymore, because their occupiers had built bases in their backyard. That's a unique flavor of tragedy. You don't even get to be an enemy in the war that kills you. You're just collateral damage in someone else's mess. Whatever's left of Canada in the Fallout timeline is probably full of resistance ghouls who've been fighting an occupation that ended 200 years ago just because nobody told them to stop. Pre-war China-Canada got betrayed by an ally. China got nuked off the map by an enemy. And the lead up to that exchange involved some of the most disturbing stuff in the entire franchise. China is the big bad of Fallout's pre-war world. The Sino-American War kicked off in 2066 and dragged on for over a decade. China invaded Alaska looking for oil. America responded by invading mainland China, and the whole thing kept escalating until somebody finally pushed the big red button. But before the bombs, the war itself was nightmare fuel. American forces were running biological and chemical experiments on Chinese POWs. The Anchorage Reclamation Campaign saw cryogenic warfare, urban combat in frozen cities, and atrocities on both sides that nobody really talks about. The propaganda machines on both ends were turning regular soldiers into walking war crimes. And then there's Captain Zhao. He's the commanding officer of the Yangtze 31, a Chinese submarine that's been stuck off the coast of the capital wasteland since the war ended. Zhao is a ghoul now, and he's been waiting in his sub for over 200 years. The wild part? He's actually completely lucid. He's not feral, he's not crazy. He's just been sitting underwater for 2 centuries trying to figure out what to do. I mean, imagine your boss told you to wait at your desk, and they'd be right back, and then they never came back for 200 years, and you had to stay sane the whole time. Yeah, I'd be writing my resignation in blood by week 3. You can either help Zhao fire one final missile at America in some last act of defiance, or convince him the war is over and let him move on. Either way, he's a perfectly preserved relic of a country we will probably never get to see. A country that ate American nukes because their government picked a fight over oil, and now we just don't talk about them. Australia-China got erased by enemies. Australia got erased by geography itself. Australia in 2077 was already an isolated continent dealing with the same global oil crisis as everyone else. But they had something nobody else had. They were geographically cut off. So when the world ends, you can't exactly walk to a neighboring country for help. You're stuck on a continent surrounded by ocean, and that ocean is now poisoned. Now, factor in the wildlife. Australia, even before the bombs, has things that will kill you for sport. Spiders the size of your your hand, snakes that drop out of trees, jellyfish that can stop your heart from across the room, crocodiles that grow to 20 feet. Now add radiation. Now add 200 years of mutation. Imagine a radroach but Australian. I'm getting hives just thinking about it. They probably have giant murder kangaroos down there now. Boxing kangaroos with rad scorpion tails? Tell me that's not terrifying. And honestly, I had to research Australian wildlife for this section, and I genuinely could not sleep that night, so enjoy that mental image alongside me. Whatever happened to Australia, the survivors had no allies, no aid, and a continent full of stuff already designed to kill them. That's a slow-motion extinction event we'll probably never see on screen. The Caribbean, if Australia's silence is unsettling. The Caribbean situation is just outright bleak when you actually map it out. Cuba and the Caribbean nations were caught in the middle of pre-war tensions between America and China. Many of them suffered economic devastation as global trade collapsed during the resource wars. Yeah, they were already starving before the bombs hit, but here's what makes the Caribbean uniquely horrific in the Fallout universe. The geography itself becomes a death trap. The Caribbean is made up of small islands surrounded by ocean, and that ocean is now full of radiation, mutated sea life, and storms that carry contamination across vast distances. A hurricane that picks up radioactive water and dumps it across an island chain? That's a regional extinction event in slow motion. Every storm, every season. The water is poisonous. The rain is poisonous. The fish are poisonous. And these are people who had no resources to begin with, suddenly cut off from any kind of mainland support. It's basically the glowing sea, but stretched across an entire vacation paradise. Most of the Caribbean was probably depopulated within a generation, not from nukes, but from contamination, starvation, and the slow grind of trying to survive in a place where the air itself decided to kill you. And honestly, at least the Caribbean got mentioned. The next region on this list got something even worse than radiation. It was an experiment, forgotten Africa. The Caribbean drowned quietly. Africa got used as a lab. Now here's the thing about Africa in the Fallout universe. Bethesda barely talks about it directly, but the breadcrumbs we do have paint a genuinely dark picture. Pre-war Africa was already getting hammered by the resource wars, food shortages, and the collapse of every system that kept the continent functioning. The same oil crisis that broke Europe was tearing through African nations even harder, because they didn't have the military or economic cushion to absorb it. But here's where it gets really messed up. The pre-war American government and corporations like Vault-Tec and West Tech didn't just experiment on their own citizens. The same kind of unethical research that produced the FEV virus, the same kind of let's see what happens mentality that built the Vault experiments, that mindset wasn't limited by borders. Pre-war America was the kind of country that nuked its own neighbor for resources. You really think they were treating distant continents with kid gloves? And we have at least one solid breadcrumb that points to this: the pit. Yeah, the pit is in Pennsylvania, but the disease that defines that region, the troglodyte degeneration contagion, has fingerprints all over it that suggest some serious pre-war biological experimentation got loose. The TDC mutates humans into either feral trogs or sterile wildmen, and the strain of FEV that powers it isn't from any of the known American facilities. The implication a lot of fans have run with, that contamination came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere offshore, somewhere nobody's checking on anymore. Whether that's Africa specifically or some other out-of-sight, out-of-mind research site, the point stands. The pre-war world had a habit of dumping its worst science into places it didn't have to look at. Yeah, kind of like throwing your trash in your neighbor's yard, except the trash is a virus that turns people into screaming biological nightmares, and then the bombs fell. So whatever experiments were running in those forgotten facilities, they didn't get shut down, they didn't get cleaned up, they just kept running, with no scientists, no oversight, no containment, for 200 years. Just imagine an entire continent where every abandoned research site is still bubbling away, leaking whatever it was leaking, mutating whatever wandered in. No NCR to organize a response, no Brotherhood of Steel to scavenge the tech, no vault dwellers stumble out 200 years later with quest markers on their map, just ruins. And whatever's growing in those ruins, honestly, trying to research Africa and Fallout lore is its own kind of frustrating, because there's just enough there to know something terrible happened, but not enough to know what. It's the world-building equivalent of hearing screams from the basement and the homeowner saying, "Don't worry about it." The most disturbing part is that Africa probably has the same density of pre-war horrors as America does. Maybe more. We just don't have a single single playable character, a single named NPC, a single voiced ghoul to tell us what it was like. A whole continent of stories, all sitting there, waiting for somebody at Bethesda to finally crack open that file. Russia-Africa got buried under its own forgotten experiments. Russia just disappeared from the script entirely. In our real world, the Cold War was primarily between the US and the Soviet Union. But in the Fallout timeline, the USSR collapsed earlier, and China rose to take its place as America's main rival. So Russia isn't even the bad guy. Russia just kind of vanished. So I tried digging through wikis and lore pages for Russia content, and honestly, I felt like I was researching a missing person. There are tiny breadcrumbs scattered through the games, Russian language items here and there, references to Soviet-era technology, hints in the broader lore, but there's no major storyline involving Russia in any of the main games. It's like an entire country, the largest on Earth by landmass, with thousands of nuclear weapons and a long history of authoritarianism, just got skipped over in the world building. Either Russia collapsed so completely during the resource wars that it stopped mattering, or something happened there that the developers haven't figured out how to write yet. And the most disturbing version of this is option 3, that nobody survived loud enough to tell their story. A country with that much firepower, that much history, that much trauma, just gone. No survivors, no factions, no legacy. Yeah, that's a deeper darkness than getting nuked on screen. Vietnam, Korea, and Southeast Asia Russia is a black hole. Southeast Asia is a war zone that had already been bleeding for decades when the bombs landed. We pick up hints through veterans and pre-war military references. The wars in Asia continued well into the 21st century in this universe, and they were just as brutal as their real-world counterparts. American forces were operating across Asia leading up to the Great War. Smaller conflicts, proxy wars, military presence everywhere. Vietnamese veterans show up as part of pre-war American history. So by the time the bombs dropped, places like Korea and Vietnam had already been through decades of fighting. When the nukes started flying, those regions weren't just hit, they were hit on top of being already broken. It's like getting punched in a black eye. The damage just multiplies. The Korean Peninsula in particular would have been a primary target for nuclear strikes from multiple directions. Both Koreas, gone in an afternoon, after generations of buildup, and we don't get a single canonical story from over there. Not one survivor, not one ghoul. Just centuries of war ending in radioactive silence. North Korea, Southeast Asia bled out loud, but there's one corner of that region that probably went silent in a way nobody's ready for. North Korea was already an isolated, militarized state with nuclear capability and a leadership that thrived on conflict. Pre-war, the country was running on a personality cult and forced labor camps that we know about in our timeline. In Fallout's timeline, with global resource collapse pushing every nation toward desperation, that situation almost certainly got worse. The Korean Peninsula would have been a major target during the Great War. Both Koreas would have been hit hard. But here's the disturbing part. And yeah, this is my own theory rolling off the cannon. North Korea built bunkers. Lots of bunkers. The kind of underground complexes designed to keep a regime alive through any apocalypse. So imagine this. Somewhere under the Korean Peninsula, there might still be a sealed-off bunker complex with the descendants of the original regime raised on propaganda about a war they don't even remember, ruling over a population that's never seen the sun. That's basically a vault, but worse, because nobody's coming to liberate it. Vault Tech at least had the decency to let you walk out the door eventually. North Korea would have just kept the door shut forever. The Middle East North Korea might still be down there, sealed in. But the next country on this list, it didn't just suffer the apocalypse, it caused it. The whole Fallout timeline kicks off with the resource wars, and those wars were fundamentally about oil. Middle Eastern oil reserves running dry was the spark that lit the global powder keg. By 2052, the United Nations had collapsed, and the world was tearing itself apart over fuel. So, in the Fallout universe, the Middle East collapsed before the bombs even fell. Oil reserves dried up, governments toppled, and the entire region became a war zone for years before nuclear weapons entered the equation. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, all of them descending into chaos as the world's economic engine ran out of fuel. And here's the dark irony. The fight over Middle Eastern oil eventually escalated into a nuclear exchange between America and China that wiped out everyone. Yeah, the Middle East collapsed first, then dragged the rest of the world down with it like a drowning man pulling rescuers under. So the people living in the region got hit with everything. Civil war first, resource collapse second, foreign military intervention third, and then nukes as a final parting gift from a global system they helped destabilize. The Middle East and Fallout is the apocalypse's ground zero, and we never get to see what's left. India and Pakistan. And finally, we've reached the deepest, most disturbing entry on this iceberg. The implied nuclear horror nobody wants to talk about. India and Pakistan. Now, I want to be upfront here. None of this is hard canon. Bethesda has never officially confirmed what happened to South Asia in the Fallout timeline. But hear me out, because the math is hard to ignore. In our real world, both countries have nuclear weapons and a long history of regional conflict. In Fallout's pre-war timeline, with the resource wars driving global desperation and economic collapse, that situation was almost certainly even worse. The subcontinent was home to over 1 billion people in our world's 2077. Now, picture this. In the chaos leading up to or during the Great War, with global tensions at their absolute peak and resources collapsing everywhere, two nuclear-armed neighbors with a long history of hating each other are sitting on enough firepower to wipe each other off the map twice over. The math basically writes itself. It's reasonable to assume that South Asia experienced its own regional nuclear exchanges either before or during the Great War. So that's potentially over 1 billion people erased without a single canonical mention in the games. An entire civilization, multiple ancient cultures, regions older than most countries, just gone, and not even acknowledged. That's the most disturbing entry on this iceberg, not because of what we see, but because of what's implied. Bethesda didn't show us India and Pakistan because the scale of their potential destruction is too big to fit into a video game. It's a mass casualty event that exists only as math in the background of the timeline. The final layer so, we've gone all the way down. And what's the takeaway? The most disturbing part of Fallout's world isn't always what we know, it's what we don't know. The games show us America, and they show us a wasteland. But that wasteland is just one small slice of a planet that died. Every country, every culture, every region had its own ending. And most of those endings were worse than anything we've actually seen on screen. There are billions of stories the games will never tell. Entire continents that just stopped existing in the narrative. Survivors in countries we never visit, living through their own versions of hell. That's what makes Fallout's world building so genuinely haunting. It's not just a wasteland, it's a global graveyard, and we only get to read a few of the headstones. The rest are still out there, weathered and forgotten, waiting for somebody to ask the right question. I really hope Bethesda eventually shows us more. I want to know what happened to wherever Tenpenny called home. I want to see what Kate left behind in Ireland. I want to walk through the ruins of Beijing and figure out what Captain Zhao was really waiting for. I want to know what's hiding under those Korean bunkers. Because the Fallout universe is way bigger than America, and the disturbing stories out there in the rest of the world are just waiting to come back to the surface. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every cannibal in Fallout explained in 20 minutes, click the video on the screen.